the bedroom pierced through Th ears. He stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. He almost fainted at the sight where wine was jumping, dancing and eating. With a deep frown, Th walked over to the speaker and turned the music off. The sudden silence made wine freeze mid-dance. "What are you doing?" he asked coldly. She jumped down, munching the cake, and stared at him head to toe, nodding her head. "Good, very good. You are more handsome than you seemed at the altar." She patted his chest and said with a grin, her voice muffled with the cake in her mouth. Then crossed his arms over his chest, his dark eyes narrowing. What was that? Wine offered him a wide, innocent smile, bits of cake visible on her lips. "Nothing, just enjoying my wedding day," she said, swallowing the last bite of cake, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand and throwing her arms in the air. "Celebrating," she nodded with a grin. "Were you that impatient to get married?" He leaned forward and asked, staring right into her eyes. For a moment, Wine felt her heart would peek out of her ribcage. He reached out, gently brushing off a crumb her cheek. "I wanted to experience something new. I want to have a new family and people around me." She let out a dry laugh and said, then stared at her amusingly. "Really? Is that so?" She nodded vigorously. "Yes, and there's one more reason as well." He raised his brows, stepping close to her until her back was pressed against the wall. "What's it?" He rested his left hand beside her right ear on the wall and leaned his face close. Wine gulped hard at the proximity. "I didn't want to study, so this was an escape," she said proudly with an innocent smile. Then smiled. "So you want to stay at home and be a housewife?" "Exactly. I want to enjoy being a handsome billionaire's wife and leave all those boring studies behind." She giggled. Then pressed his smile, keeping on a cold face. "Is that so? Are you sure you want to be a housewife?" He tucked the hair strand behind her ear. "You must know the duties and responsibilities of a wife, right?" Wine blinked several times, staring at him confusingly. "What duties and responsibilities?" she asked with a frown and scrunched her nose. "Are you that new? Should I explain practically?" There was an underlying seriousness that made her nod along. His fingers grazed her waist, sending shivers down her spine. Hey, what are you doing? Move away." She glared at him and pushed him lightly. Then chuckled. "You just agreed to explain these duties and responsibilities for a wife." Wine lightly smacked her head and scrunched her nose out of habit. "I wasn't in my right mind," she huffed, still glaring at him. "I see, so you don't want to perform your duties and take any responsibility." She nodded, rolling her eyes, then shoved his hands into his pockets. "All right, but you have to continue your studies. There's no exception." Wine's eyes widened in shock. "What did you just say?" She grabbed his collar violently. "How can you be so cruel and heartless? What have I done to you? Don't you feel pity for me?" She shook him violently and said, "I don't want to study means I don't want to. I just want to live a peaceful life without any stress. Got it?" she said dramatically, then held back the laughter that erupted in his throat. "What are you staring at? Answer me," she yelled, shaking him, then held her hands and removed it from his collar. "You will study, and that's my final decision." Wine let out a frustrated groan. "Please, you're such a nice man. I'll be a good wife," she whined, poking his chest with her index finger. Then shook his head in denial and turned to the washroom. Wine lay on the bed, messing her hair and groaning, "As if I want to do business." He heard her fake cry as he closed the door behind him with a smile. After a few minutes, Sam came out of the washroom and found Wine rolling on the bed and punching it. "Stop being so dramatic." He adjusted the pillow and laid, closing his eyes. "Sleep quietly. Don't act as if I'm sending you to the battlefield. Is studying any easier than going to a battlefield?" He opened his eyes and turned his head sideways to her. Wine laid on her stomach, resting her chin on her palms, and stared at him innocently with a pout. "Pretty please, I don't want to study," she whined coyly, then smiled inwardly and shook his head. "No more arguments about this." He spoke sternly, yet his expression remained soft. "You are a cold-blooded tyrant," she groaned and said, then held her hand and pulled her towards him. Wine stared at him with wide eyes as she crashed into his chest. "Do you want me to use my own way to keep your mouth shut?" he asked in a low, husky tone. She swiftly shook her head in denial and placed her index finger on her lips. "I'm quite, see?" he nodded. "Good, sleep quietly. You'll surely wake the beast in me if you make any more noise." She gulped, staring at his serious face. "Are you not a human but supernatural?" His glare made her flustered. "I'm quite," she mumbled, then closed his eyes, holding her in his firm embrace. Wine turned her back to him, trying to break free from his embrace. "Stay still," he muttered in her ear. Wine froze, feeling his hot breath fanning her ear and neck. She closed her eyes, subconsciously leaning into his embrace. Next morning, Th blinked awake, his gaze gradually focusing on the ceiling above. He let out a slow and content breath. After ages, he felt a warmth deep down in his heart. Glancing down, he saw Wine nestled against his chest, her head resting on his upper abdomen. Her arm was tucked under his neck and one of her legs was draped lazily over his waist, holding him close. Her lips were slightly parted and her breathing was soft and steady as she clung to him in her sleep. Th couldn't suppress the small smile that crept onto his face at the sight. Gently, he brushed a strand of hair away from her face and caressed her face with his thumb gently. He stared at her for a while and then brought the edges of her hair to her nose. Wine scrunched her face, feeling ticklish, and shifted slightly, pressing her face against his chest. Th poked her nose. "Wake up, sleepyhead. You're all over me." Wine groaned, clinging further onto him. "Let me sleep for a while," she mumbled drowsily. "It's already late. I guess you don't just want to get out of my embrace." He held her tighter. Wine snapped open her eyes and looked at her position. She let out a forced chuckle and pulled away from him, but Th didn't release her. "I didn't realize." She ran her fingers through her hair and yawned, then stared at her groggy face. She rested her chin on his chest and stared at his features. She trailed her finger over his jawline when her gaze landed on the faint scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone. "What's this?" she asked softly, her fingers reaching up to gently trace the line of the scar. Then stiffened slightly, his eyes turned cold. "It's nothing." He caught her wrist lightly. "It doesn't look like nothing. It must have hurt a lot," she said, sincerely concerned. Th sighed deeply. Hurt flashed through his eyes, but he masked it. "Why are you so interested?" he asked, his voice softening as he let go of her wrist. "Because you are my husband now and I need to know everything about you." She shifted closer. "You're persistent, aren't you?" "Very. It just makes me wonder what kind of life you had. I want to know more about you, about your past." Th met her gaze, his heart warming at the genuine concern in his eyes. In her eyes, he could tell she wasn't just curious, she cared. He felt an indescribable feeling in his heart. "Maybe I'll tell you someday," he said softly, brushing a thumb over her cheek. Wine nodded and hummed while something clicked in her mind. "Wouldn't you change the decision of my studies?" He shook his head. She slapped his chest lightly. "You are heartless. Look at my innocent face. Don't you feel bad for me?" He rolled his eyes. "Stop being so dramatic. You'll study and no one can change this decision. You can stay at home for a month." She pulled out of his embrace and sat straight. "I don't like you a bit." She threw the pillow on his face and stormed to the washroom. Then laid on bed, staring at the ceiling and smiled widely. Time skip. Days had flown in a blur of late-night dinners and elegant parties. Them's business partners and close friends had welcomed Wine into their circle, and she, in turn, had embraced the role of his wife with her usually lively spirit. She loved being by his side, her endless chatter filling the spaces that once echoed with silence. And though Theo remained the reserved, cold person everyone knew, something about her presence stirred an indescribable warmth within him. He found himself captivated by her voice, her laughter, her. Now Wine was sitting at the dinner table. She glanced at the clock, tapping her fingers on the table anxiously and waiting for Theo, who was yet to arrive from office. Finally, the door creaked open. She heard footsteps and looked up, relief flooding her features as she saw Theo step inside. He paused in the doorway, his gaze locking onto hers. "You're back. I was waiting for you," she said, placing both her legs on the chair. "It's been ages since someone has waited to eat with me," he said quietly, his eyes flashed pain. She could hear the sadness in his voice, a sadness that spoke of lonely meals and empty rooms. "But now you have me," she said brightly with a smile, trying to lift up the mood and waving her hand. "I'll make sure I don't make you wait longer," he drew close and said in a low tone. "You better not." She narrowed her eyes and warned him. "Anyway, now go and change so we can dig in." Theo kept his coat on the chair and rolled up his sleeves. "I'll just wash my hands and come," he said and went away. After a few moments, he came back and sat. They both began eating silently when Wine spoke with her mouth stuffed. "I didn't cook this. I don't really know how to cook, so I ordered in." Theo stared at her, his face expressionless. Then he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "So, you're telling me that my wife can't cook?" She nodded with a pouty, stuffed mouth. Theo's heart fluttered at the sight. "I'll try to learn," she said embarrassingly, chewing the food. "But only if you can change your decision about my studies." She slammed her fist on the table and said excitedly, "Not at all." She rolled her eyes and leaned back on the chair, scrunching her nose. "Heartless," she muttered under her breath, feeling Theo's intense gaze on her. "Theo," he hummed in response. "Did you feel bad when Oni refused to marry you and I married you instead? I know Oni is every person's dream girl. She's talented and beautiful. You must have liked her a lot." Theo leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. "I don't know how she was. I just know that I want this house to be filled with your chatter and laughter." Wine stared at him with surprise. He pulled her chair close to him. "I thought you must be angry seeing me instead of Oni," she said nervously and tugged the hair strand behind her ear. He held her chin and lifted her face. "Your parents informed me about the bride's replacement. There was no point in being angry at the very last moment." She grinned, satisfied. Oni was such a fool. She lost a gem in search of a stone, she said, shaking her head with disdain when her eyes caught the faint scar on his face. She couldn't help but touch it. "Isn't it good that she eloped with someone else?" "Of course it is good, but I think she had some misunderstanding. That stepmother of yours had some conversation with her. I hate that old witch," she muttered through gritted teeth, caressing the scar. Then let out a deep sigh and hummed, "How did you get this?" "This?" He stopped and held her hand. "Stepmother had hit me when I was young." "What? This old witch needs to get a good lesson," she muttered, furiously slamming the table and standing. "How dare she? Where was your father? Couldn't he do anything?" He held her wrist. "Calm down." He pulled her back on the chair. "Wine, if one day you hear something about me, will you trust me?" he asked, holding her hand. "Of course I will." She scrunched her nose and placed her hand on top of his. He subconsciously leaned and kissed her nose. "You're cute." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "It won't change my mind. I still don't want to study." "Since you want me to study, then you're gonna teach me because I fail every semester," she said the last part proudly. Theo laughed spontaneously and Wine felt the world stop, smile and laugh often. "It's beautiful," she said, captivated by him, and covered his face. Theo smiled faintly. "Then be the reason for my smile and laugh," he mumbled, pressing his forehead against hers. Wine smiled, staring at him. Few days later. It had been a month since their wedding, and Wine and Theo had grown pretty close to each other. Now they arrived at a party. Theo, as always, looked dashing in his tailored suit, while Wine's elegant dress flowed like glittered silk, highlighting her beauty. Everyone's head turned at them. As they moved further into the room, they were greeted by Theo's stepmother and a young woman beside her who stared at Theo with a flirtatious glint in her eyes that didn't go unnoticed by Wine. "What an unpleasant sight," she mumbled, leaning onto Theo. "Just ignore them." He tightened his grip around her waist and walked past them, but Wine stopped him, her eyes lit. "This is going to be interesting. Let's greet them," she said with a smile, and dragged him to them. "Hi, Mrs. Kim." Ken stood indifferently, holding one's hand and looking around while Amy had her eyes fixed on him. "Hi, Wayne. It's good to see you," she said with the sweetest smile possible. Wayne just nodded with a forced smile while glaring at Amy. Mrs. Kim cleared her throat. "Wayne, this is Amy, my niece. You might have seen her at your wedding." Amy glanced at Wayne with unpleasant expression. "Yes, I did." She turned to face him and held his fist. "What happened?" he asked in a low tone, holding her waist. "I thought there was something on your face because Amy couldn't stop staring at you." She turned her head slightly and passed her a side-eye glance. "Then let's go from here," he said in a low tone, staring at her face with a loving gaze. Amy clenched her fist, staring at them. Actually, Th and Amy had a good time together before marriage, but after his marriage they were distant. The underlying meaning didn't go unnoticed by Wayne. She turned to face them while Th was still holding her from behind. He passed them a frosty stare that was enough to freeze them. "I know, after all, Amy is quite popular with men," Wayne said with a smile. "You went," Th cut in. "I dare you call her names and see what I do." Th's expression darkened. Wayne winked at Amy and leaned on Th's chest. "Let's go, Th. Let me deal with her first," he muttered through gritted teeth and released Wayne. She turned to face him. "Why waste your time on useless people? I want to eat something," she said coyly and encircled her arms around his neck. Th heaved a sigh and nodded with a faint smile. "As you say." The rare warmth and gentleness on his face for Wayne caused Amy and her aunt to almost faint. They stared at them with wide eyes. "This bitch has wrapped him around her finger. It's all because of you, aunt." She glared at her aunt. "Why? What did I do?" "I trampled my dignity and tried to get him, but I got nothing. Neither he nor his assets." Amy muttered, gnashing her teeth. Mrs. Kim nodded. "You're right. I thought his father would get you married to him if we accused him of assaulting you." She clenched her fist. "Amy, we must create some misunderstanding between them and break them apart." Amy's eyes lit as she nodded. Wayne was sitting at a table and munching pastries while Th was somewhere with his best friend. "Hey, Wayne, why are you sitting here all alone? Come with me. I'll introduce you to my friends." Wayne swallowed and looked at her head to toe. "Friends?" "Yes, they are eager to meet my daughter-in-law." "Wayne is not your daughter-in-law and she's not going anywhere." He appeared out of nowhere and stood in front of Wayne, blocking Mrs. Kim's sight. She laughed nervously. "You're my son, Th snapped at her. "Shut up, I'm not your son." His dark eyes made her shiver. Wayne held his hand. "Calm down, Th." She stood beside him, stroking the back of his hand with her thumb. "Let me handle her," she said with a smile. Th raised his brows, seeing the excitement in her eyes. "Mrs. Kim, I'm coming. Wait for me." Mrs. Kim nodded and turned around, rolling her eyes. "There's going to be a show. Wait and watch." "What are you going to do?" he asked worriedly. "Just trust me and wait." He nodded, leaning and kissing her neck. Wayne smiled shyly and turned around. She made her way towards Mrs. Kim, who led her to the table. "Listen, everyone. This is Wayne, Th's wife." Amy rolled her eyes, looking away while Wayne nodded and sat. They began a conversation while Wayne was mostly quiet when she heard someone say, "I heard her sister, who was Th's fiancée, ran away with someone else. She must have discovered Th's character. No decent people will give their daughter to someone like him." "Yes, he even fooled poor Amy," and Wayne slammed the table and stood furiously. "Who are you to talk ill about my husband? Are you that innocent? Who doesn't know Mrs. Rocher? You used to be Mr. Rocher's mistress. Yet you dare to speak ill about others. And you, Miss Rachel, part-time mistress of every rich guy." She spat, her eyes blazing in fury. "Wayne, they aren't saying anything wrong." Wayne slapped shut her mouth while everyone's attention was fixed on them. Not a word against him. She growled and spilled the wine on her face. Mrs. Kim gasped. "How dare you, you wench! Your husband isn't that innocent. He assaulted me." Amy came towards Mrs. Kim, but before she could reach her, Wayne grabbed Amy's hair. "You throw yourself at every man out there. You still dare to accuse an innocent person." She slapped Amy several times. Mr. Kim arrived at the scene. "Hey, Wine, are you crazy?" Mrs. Kim rushed to him while crying. "Keep your mouth quiet, father-in-law, if you don't want to end up like this." She pushed Amy onto the table and opened the bottle of wine, while Thang also rushed, staring at the scene in front of him with wide eyes. "After this, you'll not accuse anyone, you bitchy bitch." She held the bottle of wine above her head and emptied it on Amy, who was yelling and cursing her. "What are you looking at, Thang? Stop your wife, she's crazy." Thang passed him a cold stare. "Not a word about my wife." They must have offended her. Mr. Kim shook his head. Someone called the security guards, but they stopped seeing Thang's cold stare. Wine pressed Amy against the table. "Leave me," she cried. "Fine, I'll leave you only if you kneel and apologize to Thang now." She hit Amy on the back with her elbow. Amy yelped in pain. "Come on." Wine hit her harder this time. "I will apologize. Let go, please." Wine smiled widely and stepped backward, breathing heavily, while Amy fell on the floor, her hair and makeup messed up. Thang came forward and held Wine. "Are you okay?" He sat Wine on the chair and gave her water. She nodded with a smile while everyone stared at him with their mouth hang open. No one expected to see this side of him. He was asking her as if they had beaten her up instead. Thang wiped her face gently with a handkerchief and adjusted her hair. "Hey you, I said something," she yelled at Amy. "This is too much, Thang." They ignored him as if he didn't exist. Amy crawled in front of Thang. "I'm sorry, please forgive me. I had accused you wrongly back then. I just wanted to marry you somehow. I thought that way your father would force you to marry me, but instead it created a misunderstanding between you and your father." She cried. Thang didn't even spare her a glance. He was busy with wine. Mr. Kim stared at her in disbelief. "Do you feel better?" he asked, cupping her face. "Yes," she said with a smile and stood. "Let's go, I'm tired." He nodded, holding her hand. They turned around to leave, but Wine stopped. "Father-in-law, your precious wife was also involved with her niece. They had planned it all together. Now call the police to take them away." She then looked at Thang. "I want to teach a lesson to those ladies," she said with a pout. Thang chuckled. "Leave them, I have called the police. They'll be here. My secretary will handle it. You are already tired, don't waste your energy on useless people. Look at them, they are already terrified." She hummed and nodded. "I want to take you somewhere." They walked away, leaving everyone in a daze. Soon Thang drove to a small apartment. "Whose place is this?" she asked, looking around. Thang smiled gloomily. "My mom's. We used to live here after Dad divorced her. I have renovated this place." Wine drew close to him and cupped his face. "You have had a tough childhood, right?" she said, caressing the scar on his face. "Kinda. After Mom passed away, I had to stay with Dad, but his wife never liked me. In Dad's absence, she used to abuse me, while in front of him, she was a different person. Dad trusted her a lot, and that distanced me from him. Then Amy appeared. She used to come and stay. I didn't feel lonely anymore as I got a good friend, but I didn't expect she would turn so wild. She wanted to marry me. When I rejected her, she accused me." Wine leaned and gently kissed the scar. "I'll make them suffer even more." She encircled her arms around his neck and engulfed him in a hug. "They'll suffer in jail." He mumbled over her neck and inhaled her scent. "Thank you for coming into my life and trusting me so much. I have spent so much time with you. It was enough to know what kind of person you are. Besides, Oni had warned me about those witches already." He pulled out, holding her face. "Thank you for today." She shook her head with a smile. He leaned and captured her lips in a soft kiss. Wine deepened the kiss, holding him close. "Thang, do you like me?" She pulled apart. "I feel something much deeper than like or love for you. You're my only family." She smiled, pressing her forehead against his. "Yet you sent me to university." He chuckled, pulling her close. "Because I want you to take over my business. That way you will be in front of me in the office. But I can come there without working. You'll be bored doing nothing." She hummed in response. "Not bad, I'll be a businesswoman. That's cool." She giggled, thanked her forehead and embraced her in a hug.